Hi, my name is Julie Baird. I'm Director of Museums, Archives, Libraries and Learning at the City of Newcastle. Firstly, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm speaking from today, and I extend that respect to the traditional custodians of the land today's virtual attendees are joining us from. What are the national standards? The National Standards for Australian Museums and Galleries is focused on key areas of activity common to organisations that care for collections and provide collection, exhibition and program-based services to the community. The National Standards aim to support Australian museums, galleries and collecting organisations across all organisational objectives, from high-level policy, planning and stakeholder liaison to practical everyday activities. Standards assist organisations with everyday operations, meeting responsibilities to their various stakeholders, attracting support and achieving their other organisational objectives. The National Standards Task Force is a voluntary committee with representatives from most states and territories responsible for the development of the national standards for Australian museums and galleries. The member organisations are peak professional bodies for the sector in their respective states and territories and represent multiple standards and accreditation programs. In 2021, the task force received funding from the Ian Potter Foundation to undertake a significant update of the national standards. This update has involved creating new content in response to major changes in ideology and museum practice since the original version in 2008. These changes include areas such as accessibility, inclusion, sustainability, and digital engagement. The most significant aspect of the update has been working to embed First Peoples engagement throughout the standards, in line with First Peoples, a roadmap for enhancing Indigenous representation in museums and galleries. Areas where there's been significant development to museum practice since 2008 are accessibility, inclusion, sustainability, and digital engagement. Donna Biles Fernando, a woman of Murari and Yemba people, and Debbie Abraham were commissioned by the task force to undertake a nationwide consultative project, which they've titled Remapping National Standards Pathways. In this presentation, they'll discuss the consultative project further.
Hi, I'm Donna Biles Fernando and I'm a Murawari and Yempa woman, and I was the lead consultant on the Remapping National Standards Pathways, embedding First Peoples active engagement in National Australian Standards for the museums and galleries.
And I'm Debbie Abraham, Arts Consultant. I work with Donna on the project. We worked together over the second part of 2021 and into the beginning of 2022. We did collect quite a lot of data through this project, but because it's now more than a year old, we won't present it here. We're going to present probably more overarching, strategies and actions rather.
Before we begin our presentation, Debbie and I would like to acknowledge firstly that we're filming today on the lands of the Awabakal people, and we pay our respects to First Peoples elders, past and present, and we respectfully acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture as the oldest continuing culture in the world. We celebrate the diversity of language, culture, customs, ceremony and knowledge, our law, of First Peoples as traditional owners, custodians, and communities with an ongoing connection across all land and sea. We acknowledge that our museums, galleries, and other arts and cultural organisations sit within unceded lands, and we respect the significant work of First Peoples staff, consultants, knowledge holders, collaborators and creators within those organisations to support authentic cultural connections and truth-telling. In undertaking Remapping National Standards Pathways, Debbie and I would like to acknowledge the work commissioned by Amaga and carried out by Dr. Terry Janke and company in developing First Peoples, a roadmap for enhancing Indigenous engagement in museums and galleries in 2018. The roadmap is a purposeful and essential plan based on extensive research and consultation across the country. It has been our guide and our inspiration. To continue in the true spirit of consultation, the First Peoples Focus Group was established with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander renowned and innovative museum and gallery professionals. The project would not have been possible without the support and expert guidance of each member of this group. And we sincerely thank them for their vital and generous contribution throughout the process. All members gave their time freely and enthusiastically with essential support from their respective organisations.
In addition to the focus group, I would like to add my thanks. They were amazing. Special thanks to Museums and Galleries Queensland who commissioned this work and the Ian Potter Foundation who funded it, and particularly former staff from MGQ, Tara Callaghan and Leisha Walker, and also of course the National Task Force. I'd like to add my thanks also to all of the organisations and all of the people who contributed, whether it was through direct consultation, surveys, or I guess phone calls as well. So it was an amazing, without that contribution, we wouldn't have been able to carry out this project.
Absolutely not.
So there were three key outcomes that we were asked to provide: recommended changes and additions to the national standards, which would embed First Nations engagement strategies as identified in the First Peoples Roadmap, and also identified through further consultation. Recommended, also the next outcome would be recommended actions or training and support needed to ensure that the sector was proactive in actually implementing these actions. And of course the report that's also on the Museums and Galleries Queensland website, which outlined the process and the outcome of the project. In carrying out the project, we looked at key project strategies which encompassed working with the National Focus Group, as Donna outlined earlier, designing a national survey that focused on identifying levels of engagement, barriers and resources needed to support engagement with First Peoples, as well as the current use and understanding of the First Peoples Roadmap and also the national standards. Also developing further consultative processes to expand the conversation to keeping places and cultural centres, and sharing information with the sector to ensure we move forward together towards authentic, proactive engagement with First Peoples.
Key to project consultation was to ensure First Peoples' voices were integral to shaping the process and outcomes. To guarantee this, and from the outset, the focus group was formed with all states, territories and national organisations. During the initial phase, the Council of Australian Museum Directors and the Council of Australian Art Museum Directors were contacted to canvass their support for the project, including the survey and staff focus group involvement. Other groups and service organisations such as the Contemporary Art Organisations Australia were contacted by either the National Task Force or by us to ensure participation in the survey. Project research and consultation were carried out in several phases. Analysis of the First Peoples Roadmap, the report and draft connecting custodians policy. Actions and strategies were mapped across the roadmap to correspond in sections to the national standards to identify opportunities and gaps. The focus group began online meetings in late October 2021 to discuss the contents and key directions of the draft national survey prior to it being sent out to the sector. Meeting again to discuss the survey results and the draft recommendations for the national standards in early December 2021 and early 2022. The remapping survey was designed to assess the current position of the sector against the target set in the First Peoples Roadmap, particularly in the areas of employment, policy, programming, and encompassing questions around barriers to engagement and policy development and resources and training. The survey was sent out via the National Task Force and to all organisations representing national, state, regional and local museums, galleries, contemporary art spaces, craft and design organisations and art centres. In total, there was 211 responses. In addition to that, to establish a sense of current connection between museums, galleries and keeping places, cultural centres, a shorter survey was conducted directly by myself with a number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander keeping places and cultural centres across the country. Other research conducted via industry webinars and by assessing industry resources. The National Task Force via the staff at MG Queensland reviewed and monitored the project. Key areas covered in the National Survey and Consultation were First Peoples employment, reconciliation action plans, organisational action plans, cultural safety, cultural competency training, policy and strategy, advisory committees and board representation, programming and truth-telling, repatriation of First Peoples ancestral remains, secret, sacred and cultural materials, acknowledgement, retail operations and the use of the First Peoples Roadmap and the national standards.
In Part A, Management and Governance, the recommendations included ensuring all policies, strategies, plans and procedures are culturally inclusive and embrace First Peoples engagement, consultation, procurement strategies, and also consider broader guiding policy and protocol documents such as the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Also develop First Peoples engagement and interpretation policies and reconciliation action plans or related internal First Peoples action plans. Support cultural safety through including cultural competency training in all staff and volunteer inductions while ensuring all staff are trained and the training is updated on a regular basis. Establish consultative mechanisms, which is really important, such as First Peoples advisory committees, to ensure community and cultural consultation and inclusiveness, and to enhance all aspects of the organisation's governance, operations, programming, and collection management, including fees for committee members. Consideration for returning First Peoples cultural material as a part of the organisation's constitutional wind-up clause to First Peoples organisations and all cultural custodians. In Part A, we also wanted to include ensuring communication modes for digital and analogue records are accessible to communities and that any records pertaining to First Peoples cultural material are kept in a culturally appropriate manner. Ensure management board representation and recruitment processes are inclusive of cultural and gender diversity and that First Peoples are involved in the recruitment process. Also developing mentoring for First Peoples to increase pathways to leadership, really important, and ensure First Peoples are involved in storage and handling of their cultural material.
Vital.
Include First Peoples traditional contemporary land management processes in any site management plans. And include ethical procurement of First Peoples products, for example, being members of the Indigenous Art Code in commercial plans and operations.
Absolutely, should be a business as usual process.
Indeed. In Part B, People and Programming, we wanted to include develop First Peoples proactive, consultative and co-designing processes for programming, particularly inclusive of truth-telling and language with fee payment for all work carried out. Also plan for inclusion of First Peoples celebratory and commemorative events in the organisation's annual programming in consultation with First Peoples. Involve First Peoples in program development and delivery, including interactive and digital presentation. Ensure two-way sharing and ethical approaches to research of First Peoples cultural material. Develop policies and procedures related to ethical, legal and moral reproduction and replication of First Peoples cultural material. Consider First Peoples cultures as diverse, ongoing and as contemporary living cultures. Include First Peoples acknowledgement, example on road signage and in venue dual naming, perhaps using local languages where possible. And develop audience engagement strategies aimed at building audiences, including First Peoples audiences and wider audiences for First Peoples programming and projects. In Part C, which is about collections, we recommended the standards consider colonial collecting practices and what that means for First Peoples, consult with First Peoples about significance, care, conservation, access and display of cultural material in the collection, and embrace contemporary collection practices, including shared custodianship, which I think is important. Source appropriate legal and cultural support to ensure ethical cultural material transactions. Develop an Indigenous cultural and intellectual property policy. Consider the possibility of sensitive and restricted access to some First Peoples cultural materials and how that can be managed through consultation. Consult First Peoples cultural custodians before digitising any material. Provide outreach, collection care, workshops and/or support. And that really First Peoples are consulted about policy and procedures related to how and where ancestral remains, secret sacred objects and cultural materials are stored and handled, as well as those who can actually have access to them and how that access is managed.
In addition to the recommendations for the standards, the focus group identified additional actions, support and training. Employment audit of First Peoples working in the sector, to undertake a sector-wide, comprehensive audit of First Peoples staff, including numbers, levels, terms of funding arrangements and sources, with a view to highlight shortfalls and improve employment opportunities. Skills audit of First Peoples working in the sector, to undertake a sector-wide comprehensive skills audit of First Peoples, to enable to share skills, expertise and identify gaps for training and education. Employment strategies and support, museums, galleries and other arts and cultural organisations to develop and implement a number of strategies to improve, increase and support First Nations employment across the sector. Establish a national network, facilitate a First Peoples network directed by First Peoples with multiple forums and opportunities to enable and accelerate change and improvement across the sector. Establish a national cultural competency accreditation. In consultation with First Peoples, investigate ways in which to establish a cohesive national accreditation program for cultural competency with both providers and participants, and develop more targeted training for specialist areas within the sector. Developing strategies to build better respectful and reciprocal relationships. This goes broadly across all of our recommendations within the standards and out of the focus group as well. Supporting repatriation, lobbying government to develop and fund more programs that support repatriation on all levels. Training and support for developing reconciliation action plans. In consultation with Reconciliation Australia, deliver more training and support for organisations to encourage the development of RAPs across the sector. Promotion of key guiding documents. Develop promotional and national coordinated and consistent national standards accreditation programs to encourage more organisations to utilise the First Peoples Roadmap and the national standards.
So for us it's been a really valuable project, and I think for museums and galleries it's outstanding. It's now, the standards have now become a contemporary, living and meaningful document, and hopefully the whole industry will move forward together and embrace First Nations engagement on all levels of their organisations.
And we'd also again like to highlight the First Peoples Focus Group, who gave so freely of their time, not only for scheduled meetings online, but also really took the time to look at the survey results, really thoughtfully look at the sector overall, and to give their recommendations not only as sector professionals but as First Peoples on the way to move forward in a cohesive and consistent manner across the sector in truth telling, not only in exhibitions but across the board on all levels. And we thank everybody who helped us along this journey, and we look forward to getting any feedback around the standards and how you're using them in your organisation. And thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.
I would now like to share with you 3 case studies from museums and galleries across Australia, which speak to the key content areas which have been developed as part of this new edition: First Peoples Cultural Protocols, Environmental Sustainability, and digital engagement. Nathan Mudye, Sentence Head of Collections, First Nations at the Powerhouse Museum, will discuss with us the collection management principles in relation to how staff at the museum record the cultural protocols associated with particular cultural belongings.
My name is Nathan Mudye Sense. I'm a Wiradjuri man, family traditionally from Mudgee, New South Wales. I work here at the Powerhouse Museum as Head of Collections First Nations. Thanks to the tireless work of First Nations leaders for decades inside and outside the museum sector, self-determination of First Nations people and adhering and respecting First Nations people's rights to their cultural heritage is becoming a larger part of collection management principles. And it's something here at the Powerhouse that we want to embed in our own collection management principles. So, for example, one of the projects we are working on is to record the cultural protocols associated with particular cultural belongings to ensure that they are handled, stored, are provided access to in a way that's in accordance with what the community want and what the community's protocols are. For example, if something is men's business or women's business, that is recorded within our database record and affects how a particular cultural belonging is stored, is being able to provide access to, and how staff handle it and how staff may conserve it. And we believe this is important, again, to empower First Nations self-determination, but also to provide cultural safety for staff at the Powerhouse, as well as community that may come to access the collection. So we record the protocol, and it may be flagged within the place we store it. If it's, say, a men's business, there may be a flag to warn staff or people visiting that, a particular shelf may contain men's business. We also would flag it on our database record to warn staff to ensure staff's cultural safety. But what's predicated on doing this work is actually knowing what the protocols are. And historically, museums have not, asked those sort of questions, asked about the longevity of cultural belongings that are entering their collection, for which way do the community want them to be preserved, how they want them to be stored, what questions should we ask if people want to access them. So we are now working to do that, and that's all predicated on communities' right to know what cultural heritage of theirs is in our museum collection. So we are now working to outreach to community to let them know that certain cultural belongings are in our care, and that they have the right to assert how we sort of take care of them. We want this to be a collaborative custodianship. And that's why I'm actually very excited for these new national standards. I can see that building on the First Peoples roadmap, that self-determination is a large part of how these standards are, what they sort of, advocate for. And I love that the right to know is actually a large portion of it, with, guidance around how and why museums should be doing outreach to community to ensure that they know what cultural heritage a museum may hold that relates to their community, their history, and their languages. My advice to museums that want to engage in similar work is to start slowly. A lot of our museums have been around for a long time, so it'll actually take a long time to do this work. So we need to do it slowly, we need to do it respectfully. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't start at all. We definitely need to start now, but we need to start with a sort of respectful slowness. I also believe that museums that want to engage in this work need to engage with an open mind and not have a sense of rigidness. We need to be flexible. We need to understand community needs to be able to fully embed self-determination in what we want to do. and that means listening and not having our own preconceived ideas of what community want.
Environmental sustainability is embedded throughout the new edition of the national standards, with each part of the document looking at environmental sustainability in different areas of museum practice. Part A looks at a management and governance perspective. Part B examines exhibition and programming contexts. And Part C talks to collection management contexts. This next case study will speak to the key content area. National Trust Victoria has developed a Climate Action Plan, a CAP, 2021 to 2023, to enable them to contribute tangible and meaningful action to address the climate and biodiversity crisis. Maddie Moore, Acting Manager Advocacy with the National Trust Victoria, will tell us more about this plan.
Hello, I'm Maddie Moore, the Acting Manager of Advocacy at the National Trust in Victoria, and I'm here to share with you a case study of our climate action initiatives. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm filming from the lands of the Bunurong people. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands on which you all join us today. I pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and acknowledge their continuing connections to land, waters, and community. Each state and territory national trust in Australia is a fully autonomous entity. The National Trust in Victoria is the state's premier community-based heritage advocacy organisation. We coordinate major events, host collection exhibitions, and educate hundreds of students per year as part of our education programs. We rely heavily on community support generated through membership, subscriptions, donations, and property submissions. The NTV Climate Action Plan was launched in June 2021. The NTV has long been aware of the developing climate and biodiversity crisis and the unique role that heritage can play to contribute new strategies to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change. For many years, we have made efforts to practice sustainable management in the custodianship of our sites and support sustainability through our advocacy work, such as our significant tree and landscape registers. We recognise that as an established community leader, educator, and caretaker of Victoria's heritage, we have a responsibility to utilise our platform to champion the identification and contribution of meaningful solutions to ensure that our cultural heritage is secure into the future. We can communicate and share our knowledge, and we can lead by example. The Climate Action Plan sets out detailed deliverables regarding 4 key actions. They are active decarbonisation. We will take active steps to reduce the carbon footprint of our heritage assets and organisational operations through sustainable consumption, clean energy, and resource efficiency, in line with the Paris Agreement goal to limit the rise in global temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius of warming. Bold advocacy and activism. We will use our position as a trusted voice for heritage in Victoria to advocate for creative and innovative policy, planning, and design solutions that can achieve active carbon reduction and sustainable solutions which will contribute to the preservation of our cultural heritage. Empowering community leader. We will communicate and engage with our members and supporters to take tangible and meaningful action to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of the climate and biodiversity crisis. And lastly, innovative custodian of heritage. We will take active steps to understand, integrate, and share best practice conservation methods and materials that can both preserve our heritage assets and collections and increase carbon and resource efficiency. Through the delivery of these actions, we have seen many successes, such as building on international and local research to advocate for the adaptive reuse of existing buildings to be prioritised over demolition and new development. As we know, there has been extensive research into the adage, the greenest building is one that is already built. We saw tangible results from our submission to the Victorian Built Environment Climate Change Adaptation Action Plan, with 2 of our recommendations regarding embodied energy and adaptive reuse in existing heritage buildings included as additional objectives in the final plan. In 2022, we also joined the Climate Heritage Network, a support network of arts, culture, and heritage organisations committed to aiding their communities in tackling climate change and achieving the ambitions of the Paris Agreement. While at one of our properties, Mooramong Homestead in Skipton, we also successfully secured funding for an energy audit through Sustainable Victoria. Ripponlea Estate is the flagship property for sustainability at the NTV. It is on Australia's National Heritage List and showcases some of our most popular events and sustainable projects. In 2013, we received a grant that enabled the replacement of the original 1960s terracotta roofing tiles. The project also involved the installation of solar panels to reduce the property's carbon footprint and allowed for more efficient harvesting of stormwater to add to the water sustainability of the site and, most significantly, contribute to the upkeep of the gardens. Through a drainage grant in 2020, the site has been further improved with repairs and restoration to components of the unique water system that underpins the house, lake, and garden. Ripponlea is also home to over 200 historic trees aged up to 150 years. Through the Trees for Life project, on-site interpretation and digital resources will be combined to promote public awareness about the historic trees and deliver key health and environmental messages. The online and digital resources will include key data about each tree, including name, classification, origin, age, uses, and their level of carbon storage. Our future goals as part of these climate action initiatives include the production of a discussion paper on heritage-based climate action and solutions to be publicly promoted as an advocacy tool for the community, as well as the further integration of sustainable practice into our asset management plans and organisational policies. A recurring message we have noticed throughout our involvement in this campaign has been the need to advocate for heritage as a climate action solution, not just a victim of climate change. The link between sustainability and heritage is not obvious to everyone in our community, and being the voice for what heritage has to offer to mitigate climate change is a gap the National Trust is seeking to fill in Victoria. If you are interested in finding out more about the work of the National Trust in Victoria, we'd encourage you to please visit our websites and read about our work for yourself. Thank you.
Amanda James, Senior Curator Community Engagement, and Catherine Manning, Senior Curator Digital at the History Trust of South Australia, will present an overview of the Digitising Collections SA pilot project and discuss working with communities to boost their digital literacy and their ability to digitise and manage collections.
Hi, I'm Amanda James from the History Trust of South Australia. I'd like to thank my colleague Catherine for her help in putting this case study together. The History Trust of South Australia respects the primary place of Aboriginal people in our history, which extends millennia into the past. I acknowledge that I am speaking today from the beautiful lands of the Kaurna people, where I have been lucky to live for most of my life. I pay my respects to Kaurna elders past and present and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present today. In 2022, the History Trust of South Australia delivered a 6-month pilot training project to standardise and develop digitisation skills, knowledge and capacity across both state-funded and community collecting organisations. The pilot was done under the auspices of the State Government's Digital Access Consultative Group and in line with the Government of South Australia's Arts and Culture Digital Access Plan. This plan was developed in 2020 to improve the public's access to our irreplaceable cultural collections and outlines standards aligned with the just-released National Standards for Australian Museums and Galleries. Significant outputs of the project have included a series of training resources and workshops pitched at beginner, intermediate and advanced levels of digitisation, technical and life cycle training delivered by digitisation experts, a selection of digitisation equipment in a box kits for loan, development of a community of practice throughout the distributed collections, and a series of lasting video resources. The History Trust is working towards a digital by design approach across our many operations. As the key agency supporting community history in the state, we endeavour to extend this approach to the South Australian History Network. This network consists of around 300 community collecting organisations. The SA History Network has a keen interest in collections digitisation for both preservation of collections and to facilitate making collections more accessible. All up, about 50 organisations participated at some point in the Digitising Collections SA pilot project. The SA History Network has a strong interest in and willingness to tackle digitisation projects, and the Trust has been supporting work in this area for about 20 years now. Mainly this has been done through our grant schemes for community organisations. From undertaking the Digital Collections SA pilot project, the Trust now has a better handle on the collections digitisation landscape in South Australia. One aspect of the pilot project was to survey groups before commencing the pilot, and that elicited some very useful information that helped to shape the project. A key one was an astonishing 84% of respondents who said they were already digitising collections without using any external guidelines or resources. Through the pilot project, there is now consistent and readily accessible information about digitisation of collections in a South Australian context available online. This personalisation is being very well received, and the community groups who have contributed to the video stories on the website have found the experience empowering and reaffirming of their own practices and experiences. The History Trust expects community interest in collections digitisation to keep increasing in the years ahead, as more and more organisations recognise the value they can gain from digital projects for both collection preservation and sharing of collections. As an adjunct to the pilot project, the Trust trialled a dedicated digitisation grant round. This further affirmed the demand for funds for collections digitisation and for creatively presenting digitised collections. Results of funded projects will be presented through the Digitising Collections SA website later in the year. Digitising Collections SA is not intended to remain static, and, resources pending, the Trust intends to expand the project. We would do this in line with the needs and responses of the SA History Network, and to keep up with accepted standards for digitisation practice. The inclusion of benchmarks relating to collection digitisation in the revised national standards further supports the work that the History Trust is doing in this space. Digitising Collections SA has been an enlightening and energising project that provides resources and real-life case studies to show what can be achieved and how to go about quality collections digitisation. When working with community groups, the Trust asked for their top tips for undertaking digitisation projects. Overall, their top 3 were: do your research on equipment needs and get advice, plan projects thoroughly in relation to your particular collection, and think about digital asset storage and future use. For more advice from the SA History Network, check out the videos on the Digitising Collections SA website. You can also find more background information about the pilot project here.
Thank you for joining us for the launch of the National Standards for Australian Museums and Galleries 2.0. The task force are happy to answer any questions that you have relating to the national standards.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll ask my fellow participants to raise their cameras and mics, and we'll get everyone together for our panel. Okay, fantastic. We have everyone with us. So I can see, just to start with, we had a question about the slides that were behind Julie. I'm sorry that you had some issues reading those. We're happy to share those on our website. So that's the Museums and Galleries for New South website. We'll also make those available via email. So we had a couple of questions before the session even started. To start with, we had a question regarding let me just bring that up, sorry. Is there a minimum meter display space to be classified as a regional gallery? Would any of my fellow panelists like to talk to that one? Amelia, can I hand over to you?
Sure. Thanks, Emily. I guess what I would say in response to that is the national standards are not designed to be prescriptive, and the national standards are not defining what is and isn't a regional gallery or a museum. We know that in the Australian museum and gallery sector, there are museums, galleries, collecting organisations of so many sizes, so many governance models, that we're not about setting definitions, particularly with relation to space like that. So that's not really one of the considerations that the standards would be looking to answer.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So the second question we had was a little more involved. What thought/action has been taken towards ensuring the implementation of the national standards? Standards are essential for best practice, but if there is no external oversight or reporting obligation on Australian institutions to ensure compliance with the standards, then it's hard to see how the current situation will not simply continue. Compliance across the cultural sector is complex and difficult, but surely some simple steps could be implemented, at least for institutions that receive government funding and/or tax incentives. This was a complicated one. However, I think the best way to address it is rather bouncing off what Amelia said a moment ago, which is that the standards are not prescriptive. They are aspirational. They're designed for organizations to work towards, and they definitely don't put any restrictions in terms of legal or government funding. Also, as we discussed in our meeting before this, organizations who receive government funding do already have funding agreements that they are obliged to stick to. Would any of my other panelists like to add on to that?
I think you've nailed it, Emily. I think the standards are deliberately created to be used by a really, really diverse range of organisations, and also the ways that each organisation uses the standards will likely differ. We also have to remember that the standards are used by volunteer-run organisations, so they're deliberately designed as a framework that each organisation in its own specific context can pick up and use. They're not designed to be a regulatory framework in any way.
Fantastic. Thank you, Amelia. And I think that actually links on to our next question, which was about volunteer museums or organizations using the standards. Would you like to continue?
Sure. Or maybe also, I'll have an answer, but I might also throw to Amanda, because I know that in SA they have a really strong volunteer-based program. I guess I would say I've got a couple of responses. In states with formal programs, the program and the program staff are really working to translate the standards and to adapt them to the context, capacity and challenges and focuses of volunteer organisations. So that's always happening when you're working in a formal program. But I guess I would also say that even if you're not working in one of those formal programs for volunteer organisations, they're still really useful. The standards are still useful for communicating externally for volunteer organisations. They can be used for leverage to local government, to donors and supporters, for explaining this is why we do what we do and this is why we do it in this way. So they still provide a really helpful leverage mechanism and communication mechanism. They also provide a way to make sure you're abreast of new resources, making sure the resources that you're using have been selected by professional organisations. So I think there's lots of different ways that they can still be really relevant and useful. But then I might hand the virtual mic back to Amanda.
Thanks, Amelia. Yeah, no, I agree with what Amelia said. I think in the volunteer context, remember that the national standards is a guideline. So there's no enforcement of it. And although the standards are used behind some programs in different states in Australia, like the History Trust's own one for South Australian groups, it's not meant to be a regulatory thing, and it's not done in an enforcement way. And there's lots in the standards that are just, it can be useful for a smaller group to think of the standard as like a one-stop shop for getting that brief information, finding some good resources, getting some hints about what current best practices actually are, and picking and choosing the bits of it that suit your particular situation and circumstances, because all museums are different. There's 300 odd in South Australia, and not one is like the other, and not one, if they were using the national standards in full, would be using it in the same way.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. The next question we had was an interesting one regarding the future of AI in the museum context, and how future iterations of the standards might address developments in the AI space. And I think that what we have been trying to do with the standards, and something that will be obvious going forward, is that the standards are developing over time. They're something that will continue to change over time as new best practice comes forward. Practice in the museum and gallery space changes throughout time, as we've seen between 2008 and now. And I'm sure that practice will continue to change further in the future. Did anyone else have anything they wanted to add?
Yes, I will. I would personally love to see an exhibition generated by ChatGPT. I did suggest it at work. It didn't go down great with the rest of the curators, but I think there's an opportunity. It's a good way to talk about where you're getting your information from and the research. But hey, who wouldn't love it if some kind of chatbot could catalogue for us? So let's hold on to that one and hope for the future, I think.
Fantastic, thank you. So I can see we've had a question coming through, which is, can we share the national standards document? That is definitely something we will be doing. So following this webinar, we will be sending out an email to everyone who signed up to the webinar, which will include a link to the national standards document. All of our organisations will also be hosting the national standards document on their websites. It should be live just about now, so feel free to jump onto our website, so M&G, New South Wales, or onto Queensland, Victoria, or South Australia's website, and you'll be able to find the national standards document there. I'll also just check if we had any other final questions.
Emily, I was just looking in regard to the first question about meterage.
So the final question that we had was, is there a national artefact repatriations policy? Would anyone like to take that one?
I can respond to that one to say that that's the kind of question you're best placed to direct to the federal government rather than the National Standards Task Force. But I can say that when you get a document like the Creative Australia policy document, obviously we read it with the members of the task force read it with a specific set of eyes, and I did see something leading towards developing legislation there. So I would say watch that space, but the federal government is your best port of call for information about that. And there is more information and standards and lots of links and resources, as Debbie and Donna mentioned, in that part C of the standards relating to repatriation. So the standards are a good place to start as well.
Thank you so much. And I'm so sorry, Rebecca, I think you're about to say something.
Oh, yes, so sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you. Just going back to that first question we had, I was just looking while we were talking and come across a very sort of general definition for regional gallery. So it's not linked to meterage, but broadly it means a public, not-for-profit, non-commercial gallery with a mandate to service a specific or defined geographic area, and also aspiring to best practice industry standards. So that's how it ties in, I guess, more broadly with the national standards for Australian museums and galleries.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So I see that we don't have any further questions, but if you do have further questions as we go forward, please feel free to get in contact either with Museums and Galleries of New South Wales or with your state representative. We will have all contact details available for all of the panelists here. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It has been an absolute pleasure to have you here for the launch of the National Standards for Australian Museums and Galleries 2.0. And we look forward to seeing the way that your organisations use this document in the future. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Bye.